With the new crafter block in 1.21, Minecraft has officially become Factorio. And as any Factorio player can tell you, ratios suddenly become very important when you're dealing with systems that operate at different speeds. If you don't immediately get why, don't worry. I have a very solid example that I've spent the past few months bashing my head against. One of the first things that many people thought of, now that we can automate crafting, is, hey, now we can make actually good fuel for our farm-fed super smelters. Certainly it was my first thought. Bamboo planks were one of the top contenders alongside kelp blocks. And there's been some scuttlebutt about which one's better. I've seen some people saying bamboo is because kelp is inefficient, which is wrong. Kelp is way more fuel efficient. And here's some math. This breaks down why, if you want to pause and check it out. After doing this first bit of fact checking you're seeing now, I decided to build a kelp-based super smelter myself. That decision was 3 months ago. I've learned a lot since then. And with each thing I've learned, I've realized more and more that without knowing some of what I'm going to be sharing with you, you're going to find it very difficult to build a good super smelter. In fact, I now fully understand how people ended up coming to the conclusion kelp is inefficient as a fuel. And just to be clear, when we're talking efficiency in this context, what is meant is minimizing how many plants are needed to achieve a certain amount of smelting power. So, what's the smallest farm we can build to get the work we need done? First things first. When we're building a super smelter, we do still need to decide what fuel we want to use. Despite kelp's higher fuel output, there are still some cases where you'd want to build a bamboo-fueled super smelter instead. If you're mostly doing small batch fueling, say you're building a 16 furnace super smelter to handle just a couple stacks of items at a time, by all means, go bamboo. They'll be quicker to set up. You clearly don't need a super smelter at that scale. You just need a decent furnace array and a steady source of fuel. Maximum lazy, you can build something like this if you only want to fuel one furnace. It'll just churn out a bunch of bamboo and turn it into planks, which will fuel whatever. However, if you're building a super smelter that is handling shulker boxes or shulker box-like quantities or a continuous item stream, and you're not aiming to build a truly ridiculously sized farm to fuel that super smelter, kelp's your best bet. And for most, I think that once we're looking to build a super smelter, once we're at the stage of the game where it makes sense to think in those large quantities, that's where we want to go. Otherwise, we'll build our little super smelter and then end up needing to upgrade almost right away. It's particularly the shulker boxes that make that relevant, as it's the largest discrete quantity of items you're reliably going to need to smelt in normal Minecraft gameplay, and it's a pretty good amount to get through for a small shulker or for a small smelter array. For example, coming back from the mines with a few shulker boxes full of ore, or maybe you brought your ender chest and it's full of shulker boxes full of ore. That's the kind of use case we're talking about. So why does kelp win out? The big thing is definitely requiring a smaller farm for an equivalent number of smelts, as we said, but kelp blocks also pack way more punch per block of fuel. They have a higher fuel density. And this really simplifies our fuel delivery system. How many times I have to hit this button to fuel this furnace? That's because bamboo planks only smelt 1.5 items. Kelp blocks smelt 20. That means when using kelp, we need to put fuel into our furnaces 13.3 times less often compared to bamboo. That was how many times we had to hit the button to fuel this furnace. Want to fuel the same amount of items with kelp? Bam. One button press. This factor has knock-on effects throughout our smelter design, especially as we scale up and hopper speed becomes a limitation. Additionally, kelp farms do have a nice side effect of being XP farms to a degree. Since we're continually processing kelp into dried kelp, each smoker in our super smelter is generating 72 XP per hour, which is in addition to whatever items we're smelting ourselves that are also generating XP. So definitely make sure to collect that XP every once in a while. It's great when you need just a quick level up and you don't want to have to go hit mobs with a sword for 10 minutes. After a day and a half of smelting, they'll each have the most XP they can hold, 46 levels about, so get to them before then. Cool. So we're going to build a kelp super smelter. How are we going to go about it? Oh, well, easy enough. It's a super smelter. They're not hard to build, right? Just take a few furnaces, item output from the furnace, fuel input to the furnace, and item input to the furnace. Make sure it's got fuel in it. It's that simple, right? Just build this as many times as you need. That's what a super smelter is, right? Actually, if you do this, you will not be building the most efficient super smelter. This is because kelp blocks smelt 20 items, which is sort of an awkward amount if we're dealing with discrete quantities that in Minecraft tend to come in stacks of 64. For a continuous item stream, it's less of an issue, but if we're building a shulker unloader that inputs to our super smelter, this is actually a really big thing to consider. To answer why, let's take a look at some graphs. So, there are 1,728 items in a shulker box. Again, this is going to be our most common quantity that a super smelter is going to be handling. So let's evaluate it as our standard case for efficiency. Okay. As you can see on this graph, which is tracking how many smelts we waste for a given number of furnaces in our super smelter, when using kelp compared to something like wooden planks, there are some dramatic and interesting ups and downs in how many smelts we waste. Wooden planks sails along at a relatively low amount regardless, but we have these peaks with kelp. Well, there's a few reasons. If you want to smelt all 1,728 items, you will need 87 kelp blocks at a minimum, which is 1,740 smelts worth of fuel. So we're slightly over the mark, but it can't be avoided given the numbers involved. What this necessarily means, though, is that we cannot have more than 87 furnaces without starting to waste fuel. Every furnace we go past that adds one more fuel that has to be in it, and that starts to add up, and it doesn't stop adding up. That makes intuitive sense, though, right? You can't put 87 fuel into more than 87 furnaces. So when you put more furnaces in and start to split the same amount of items among a larger amount of furnaces, you end up also putting more fuel into those furnaces than you need, and it gets wasted. The less obvious pitfalls are here in the lower end of the graph. We followed our Minecrafter instincts from earlier and put 64 furnaces in our smelter. We would be wasting half again as many smelts as we needed for that shulker box, and that translates into wasted fuel. This happens because with 1,728 divided by 64, you end up putting 27 items into each furnace with an equal split. So, since kelp smelts 20 items with each kelp block, you burn one kelp block for those first 20, and then a second kelp block is burned just for those last 7 items, wasting 13 smelts at every furnace in the array. At that point, we're being very inefficient. So let's not do that. Build a few more furnaces and get perfect efficiency. If you want a more compact smelter, you don't want to go all the way up to 87, you can use 44 or 29 furnaces. Those amounts waste one more fuel than an 87 furnace array when smelting shulkers, but that's not a huge deal. Now, there's something you've been thinking looking at this graph, isn't there? Yeah, sure, kelp is more efficient with this one weird number of furnaces, but for most amounts of furnaces, it looks like bamboo is way better. I'll just stick with that and skip the headache. Well, you're missing some info here. This isn't the efficiency graph. This is just measuring how many smelts we'd be wasting, which is part of efficiency. We care about it, but it's not the whole picture. This graph represents how many fuel hours, how many plant hours it takes each fuel to smelt one shulker. As in, how many plants need to grow for 1 hour to produce enough fuel to smelt 1,728 items. This is the efficiency graph. And as you can see, bamboo doesn't hold up quite so well. Even in a 128 furnace super smelter, were we so fuel wasteful to build such a thing, you would still end up needing a smaller fuel farm with kelp over bamboo. Isn't that crazy? Also, keep in mind throughout all of this as you look at these graphs, as far as how many actual blocks of fuel are needed to achieve the full smelting operation, we're talking about a stack and some change of kelp blocks compared to almost a full shulker box of bamboo. You just need so many items to make bamboo work, and it gets hard at large scales and fast smelter speeds. That said, despite the clear picture these graphs paint about which fuel is more efficient, you can see how people think kelp is the loser here. If you're regularly dealing with quantities of items under 20, or you're distributing your items poorly among your furnaces, it feels bad to see most of a kelp block burn away with nothing to cook. Bamboo is less error prone in that sense. On both graphs, we can see the line is pretty consistent, but it's amazing that even in cases where you're wasting half again as many kelp blocks as you need, you would still need less plants to keep up with your fuel usage than if you were using bamboo. Unless you're building a super smelter with 69 to 83 furnaces, or you're way over 128 furnaces, kelp is always more efficient as a fuel. Okay, so cool. We're going to build a kelp super smelter with 87 furnaces for maximum efficiency. We've got some design considerations now. How are we going to unload our shulker boxes? We're going to use hoppers, or are we going to use hopper minecarts? Cool. We're going to build a kelp super smelter with 87 furnaces and hopper minecarts to unload and deliver our items. Since they're already in minecarts, we might as well use them for delivery. How many hopper minecarts do we want to use to unload our shulker boxes? Well, 1,728 divided by 320, the amount of items that fit in a hopper minecart, tells us we're going to need a minimum of 6. Otherwise, we'd still have items left in the shulker. So, great. We only need 6. Why would we use more? We hate being wasteful, right? 6 it is. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Actually, if you do this, you will not be building the most efficient super smelter. This is because when we remove items from one shulker box and put them into our 6 hopper minecarts, that is a division operation. Like literally, math in analog form. What that means is that the whole to-do about how many items split equally among our furnaces gives us the best and most fuel efficient number, we have to recalculate that based on our new divided quantities in each minecart. What that ends up telling us is that for the specific case of a shulker box worth of items going into 87 furnaces, if we're delivering via hopper minecarts, we want to have 10 of them. Anything else, and we're not getting that theoretical max efficiency we calculated for 87 furnaces, that low point in the peaks and valleys. It also tells us how many times each cart will have to pass over our furnace array to empty itself. In this case, twice, since there are more items in each hopper minecart than there are furnaces in the array, so it has to go over again. This all is not as intuitive as the number of furnaces math, which is basically just simple division. And I definitely caution you to consider these factors when delivering items via minecart for smelting, regardless of what fuel you're using. Okay, cool. We're going to build a Kelp super smelter with 87 furnaces and 10 hopper minecarts to unload and deliver our items. Simple enough. Now, since it is going to be fueled by kelp, we should figure out how many plants we're going to need. And first, I would say run a few tests on your smelter design. Figure out how long it takes to process one shulker box. That's how much time we have to make our fuel to smelt the stuff in the shulker box. Let's say 256 seconds, a nice round number. Since we're using 87 furnaces, we only need 87 pieces of fuel, the minimum possible amount, which, since it takes 180 kelp to make 11 kelp blocks, means that we're going to need 1,423 kelp, or thereabouts. Since we have 256 seconds to make that much kelp, that means we will have to generate 5.56 kelp per second. Well, great. All we need to do now is divide this number by how much kelp each kelp plant produces in a second, and that'll be how many plants we need to run our smelter continuously. But before we talk about that, consider something. Do you actually need to run your super smelter continuously? If you do, you can probably skip most of this stuff I've been talking about and just hook a few furnaces up to the output of whatever thing is constantly giving you items that need smelting. You still probably should use kelp for the fuel richness and take your ratios into consideration for sure. I'll be the first to point that out. But you probably don't need to worry about shulker boxes or any discrete quantities. Just items per second in and fuel per second in, and you can just jam items into furnaces and kelp blocks into furnaces and let things roll. Don't make life too complicated. For the majority of us folks, though, operating super smelters non-continuously, you're probably going to want some sort of fuel reserve. Even if you don't want one, you'll end up with one more likely than not, even if it's just one hopper that ends up getting filled up. In my case, I like to go for a nice double chest of fuel, which is 54 stacks, so times 64 is 3,456. That's a good amount of fuel. Enough to keep us running for like 3 hours, or in other words, almost 40 shulker cycles. Wow. 40 full shulkers worth of items smelted by one double chest of fuel. That's the smelter density of kelp blocks coming in clutch. All right. Now that's how fast our reserves are emptying. Let's just put that in a nice per second form. Now, how fast are our reserves filling back up? Oh, yeah, we're supposed to be figuring out how many plants we're going to need, which would help us answer that question. So for this, we need to know the rate at which one kelp plant produces kelp. That rate is, of course, 21 kelp every 10,240 seconds. I've cut out the part of the video where I explain why that's the number. You're welcome. But here's the math if you want to pause and take a look. Anyway, divide the kelp per second by that we need by that number, and we get how many plants we would need to run continuously, which we don't need to do. So really, this is just the maximum number of plants we would even consider using. All right, so instead, let's calculate based on how many plants we're actually going to use. So we know we don't need 2,711. So if we say have 2,000 kelp plants, that means we're going to be generating this much fuel per second. Subtracting that from our consumption means we're going to be losing this much fuel per second, which means we'll eat through our reserves in this many seconds, which is like 10 hours of continuous smelter use. Okay, not bad. 10 hours of nonstop smelting shulker boxes one after the other. That's tough to imagine someone even needing to do, but I'm not here to judge. Here's another question. After those 10 hours, how long would it take us to replenish our reserves, to refill that double chest so we're ready for our next smelting binge? Well, just under 4 hours. Not bad at all. Now, I like these numbers. These are well within reason as far as how I can imagine myself actually using a super smelter. However, I picked 2,000 really arbitrarily. There's no reason to think 2,000 is a good number, let alone the best number. And so I'm having some trouble knowing whether there's some better quantity I could be going with. Is there some other factor I'm forgetting to consider? One that massively impacts efficiency has gone totally unmentioned and is the bottleneck of your fuel production process? Wait, how many smokers am I using to smelt all this fuel? Just one? That's enough, right? Actually, if you do this, you will not be building the most efficient super smelter. Probably the most important ratio of building a kelp super smelter is the ratio of plants to smokers, because the smokers never stop a smoking. It's even relevant if you're making a continuous design that doesn't care about the division issues with shulker boxes we've been going over. This all-important ratio is, of course, 97 and 11/21 plants per smoker. Wait, what? Why is it that? Well, it's how many items a smoker processes per second, 0.2, divided by the kelp growth rate. In other words, it's the reciprocal of the growth rate times 1/5. Okay, I guess. So it takes 97 and 11/21 kelp plants to keep up with one smoker, to make that smoker run at its maximum rate. Not a tidy number. And that sucks, because we have two potential problems that make it so we want to have the exact amount of smokers we need. The first problem is overproduction. If we make too much kelp, it can just end up sitting around and lagging our game. In fact, if we make more than one extra kelp every 5 minutes, we will continuously accumulate kelp in the system unless we do something about it. Given one kelp plant grows every 488-ish seconds, and items despawn in 5 minutes, 300 seconds, that means we can't be overproductive by more than one kelp plant. Or we'll have items hanging around, lagging our game more and more over time. So that's a really tight limit, unless we find some other way to deal with this problem. You can put the excess kelp into a bone meal farm or something, but personally, I'd prefer to avoid the problem entirely. On the other hand, we have the underproduction problem. The issue with that is since we're fueling our smokers with the kelp blocks that we make from the kelp we cook in those same smokers, we can create a negative feedback loop if we're not careful. If one kelp lands in a smoker and a whole kelp block, 20 smelts worth, goes up in smoke just to cook that one kelp, that is a net loss of fuel. That's the worst case scenario, and it'd be really hard to break anything other than the smallest setups with that, but we want to not be losing fuel that could instead go to our super smelter. Since each kelp block takes 9 kelp to make, each block we burn needs to create at least 10 dried kelp. So anything over half a smoker's full output, so 0.1 per second, given the fuel we're using smelts 20 items, in that case, the numbers actually divide quite nicely. That's a lot more leeway. In fact, let's not forget, smokers run twice as fast as furnaces, which we can also use. So actually, anything under a quarter a smoker's full output is fair game, 0.05 items per second. Still, we'd prefer to be maximally efficient somewhere in that range. So that's a whole lot of talking, but how do we understand these problems in the context of our numbers? Well, what it ends up meaning practically is that there are optimal numbers of kelp plants to have in a kelp supersmelter, an amount that doesn't overflow your kelp smelting system of smokers and furnaces, but rather just underflows it. That way, we're not accumulating items, but we're still running our kelp smokers pretty much constantly, as close to constantly as mathematically possible. We're going to call these optimal amounts breakpoints. The holy grail would, of course, be an amount of kelp that perfectly matches a whole number amount of smokers, just cleanly divides. And theoretically, that is possible. However, it becomes a lot less likely when we factor in something else I haven't brought up yet. At this point, let's just go on over to the calculator I built to make everyone's life a whole lot easier regarding all this math. All right. So what I omitted earlier is that the kelp growth per plant per second figure, this does not take into account the actual harvesting of kelp. This is just the raw growth rate. When you harvest kelp, you break it. And there's no real way to do that that doesn't interrupt its ability to grow for a certain amount of time. That is our harvesting delay. For the design I use, that harvesting delay is 16 ticks. You can figure out your own harvesting delay using tick freeze and tick step commands in creative mode. So it's easy enough to factor this number in, but from this point forward, rather than me going through the math step by step, let's just say if you're interested in the math, look at the spreadsheet formulas yourself, all right? I did all the math, and I'm pretty proud of that, but I'm also pretty sick of explaining it. I tested my own kelp farm prior to doing all this math, and I had to do math until the math agreed with what I actually measured about my kelp farm's output in reality, which is why I had to do so much math, since I had to nail down all these ratios and variables I didn't know about when I started. Okay, using this tool, plugging in our numbers. Let's go ahead, 2,000 kelp plants, 2,000 or 256 times to cycle a shulker. So we can see from this, these are its outputs as far as recommendations. We can see that 2,000 kelp plants is not a horrible number, actually. If we had 2 more kelp, we would be able to get away with using 20 smokers in 1 furnace exactly at one of those breakpoints I mentioned. So great, let's do it. Now, keep in mind, this number is specific to a farm that has 16 ticks of harvest delay. Your breakpoints may be different based on your real kelp growth rate. Now, with this tool, what this is built to do, right, is to give us a nice way to decide how many smokers we're going to use, and hand in hand with that, how many plants we're going to have. So I would say if you're going to use this, take some baseline guess for how many plants you want, evaluate where that leaves you in terms of how long before you run out of reserves versus how long to refill them. Adjust that until you're happy with the reserves numbers, and then whatever number you end up with, tweak that in small amounts based on these suggestions until it fits optimally with some breakpoint for an amount of smokers and furnaces. And to think, if I hadn't told you this, you might have built a super smelter with like 1% less efficiency. Now, let's take a second and plug in my own actual numbers for my own smelter design rather than these example numbers. 252 seconds between shulkers, and I want around 2,640 fuel. Okay, it tells us to remove 3 fuel to reach a good breakpoint. So 2637. Optimal smoker efficiency. Thanks, math. Okay. So clearly we've hit the point of diminishing returns for our calculations. We've done so much math, it can't help us anymore. So that's great, though. That means that we have everything we need now. All the important parts, I swear. We're going to build a kelp super smelter with 87 furnaces, 10 hopper minecarts, 2,640 kelp plants minus 3 to avoid overflow, and 27 smokers. Now we just have to actually build it. But that's the easy part. I mean, sure, it took a few dozen design iterations. I definitely didn't follow the nice, clean process I just laid out when I built this. I had to discover the math I needed by trial and error. And here's some of my error. I mean, really, months ago, when I started building this, I just set out to make a super smelter for my survival world. I didn't want to become Kelpert Einstein. I didn't realize what this would become, how it would consume my life. Really, the reason I'm going through all this math in the video is both to justify some of the time I've spent on this, and also hopefully to save someone else time in their own design process. So, thanks for indulging me. Anyway, hard pivot to redstone design. This is my super smelter. It's just about as small as a fuel efficient kelp-based super smelter is going to get, and it's mostly kelp farm. And again, a bamboo-based one would be even bigger. All this part, it's just making kelp. 11 stacks of 240 kelp plants each on each stack, and each of those plants is in one of these little slices. So just repeat that 2,640 times. I didn't make this design. Ilmango made it. There's a link in the description. This bit here is our 27 smokers, constantly turning kelp into kelp blocks. Also not my design. Zazuma Void made it. There's a link in the description for that as well. So these 27 smokers, they're all just this slice repeated. Kelp blocks from these smokers come over here up the water stream, pop into this reserve chest, and thus are able to flow into my furnaces. If the reserve chest is full, we actually decraft the kelp blocks into dried kelp and compost them for bone meal because we can't turn off the kelp farm. Oh, here are our 10 hopper minecarts that we mentioned. They unload the shulker in 8.6 seconds. Let's actually watch that in action. All right, shulker was dispensed. Carts are filling up. Pretty much instantly after the carts are full, they're going to be sent on their way. And then they're sent out at this interval. This specific interval is so that they pass over the hoppers with just enough time in between that the hopper that this one just passed over just unlocks in time for the next minecart to come along. The water is here to slow the minecarts down just enough that they put 2 items into each furnace instead of 1. Remember that they have twice as many items as there are furnaces. So we do have to do that and slow them down so that they don't have to go back around the loop another time to fully empty. You saw that after they were done, they were recollected into this system here, and they will be ready in this dispenser. Then we smelt for a while, for 200 seconds. So the items that are being smelted are being collected in standard fashion, hopper beneath each furnace, and they're either sent straight to the same shulker box they came from via these hopper lines, which there are 2 of, or in the further half of the super smelter, so this back half, we actually instant dropper line them around into the shulker box to save a little time. So in that sense, the shulker is actually reloading at a maximum of 4x hopper speed. So there's really no delay in the reload process since we are, with our 87 furnaces, they're sectioned out into groups of 22. Rate that a furnace creates an item is 0.1 per second. That means we've got 4 sections producing at 2.2 items per second, which is less than 2.5 items per second, which is how fast hoppers move items. So there's really not much delay introduced by the system as a consequence, which is great. We do bother with the instant hopper lines just so we don't have to wait for the items all the way over there to come around. Instead, they just are basically, teleported into the shulker box. Once the last furnace turns off, so this furnace here, there is a timer. Oh, I think we actually just missed it. There is a timer that counts down, and nope, it's still doing it. A rail will come up, this one here. The piston beneath it will activate, push this up into the shulker, breaking it, and then this hopper minecart beneath will collect the shulker, putting it into this dropper. But really, once it's in there, we can put it wherever we want. All the items that were originally inside it will be back inside it as their smelted versions, which is a nice bonus for people like me who like to color code and label their shulker boxes. Once that happens, after it's collected, this pulse repeater will fire 10 times to redispense the items or redispense the hopper minecarts back onto the track right here. And that way, we're ready for next time. The dispenser that puts the shulkers out will be triggered so that if there's another shulker ready to go, we just start over. And each time we do that, it's 252 seconds. So pretty great. Looks like we're still unloading. So we're probably just about done though. Also after the cycle, we will have the furnaces automatically reloaded. We should actually be able to see that. Yep, so here we go. New cycle. Shulker's broken. You can hear the hopper minecarts being dispensed. Here's the shulker. We can see it's got all items in it. And if we take a look up here, okay, see how that torch just turned off? That indicates that furnace slice needed fuel, and it turns off once it has the fuel that it needs. So yeah, we are all set for the next shulker that we want to toss in there. The reloading system that I just showed the torch, those are this slice repeated 87 times, and it's fed fuel by the hopper loop that sits right here and just goes in a loop. The reason we do it this way is so that we don't have to have as much fuel just kind of waiting around. You'll have one piece of fuel in the furnace, one in the dropper, and one here, and that's it. So that way we don't have to saturate the hopper like you would see in a lot of designs where there's like a hopper feeding into the furnace, so that's just full of kelp blocks, and the furnace is also full of kelp blocks. So instead of having 6 stacks of kelp sitting around in each furnace, we only need 3 kelp in each furnace. So that's very nice. It works by noticing when the furnace turns off. So the observers are keeping track of it and tying the state of the furnace to the state of this copper bulb. Furnace turns on, bulb turns off, furnace turns off, bulb turns on. And when the bulb turns on, it triggers this dropper to shoot the next piece of furnace or next piece of fuel into the furnace. And it triggers this hopper to put a piece of fuel into the dropper at the same time. So, and then this hopper being empty, this hopper gets unlocked and fuel comes in from above, and then it locks it again because it has fuel in it. So that one actually is my design. It's part of why I went through so many iterations. The smoker slices by Zazuma were great without a hitch. Great design by Zazuma. Although, part of the reason we had to do all of our math regarding smokers is because this design does not handle being underfilled well. Granted, good luck making a design that does, but still, it should be technically possible. I tried it myself in an earlier iteration of my smelter design over there, and I did get one. It wasn't one wide tileable, but it was a design that didn't suffer from being starved of kelp. The only problem was that it ran at half hopper speed. You could just build more of those, or maybe one that toggles through 2 containers for continuous flow, but nah, someone will figure it out, and all my math will be pointless, and I'll be glad. Regarding the whole construction, I've put this super smelter design through a full double chest of shulker boxes, just continuously over and over, 54 shulker boxes. It handed all 54 perfectly in sequence, gave us back the smelted items in the original containers. Love it. It does only work on full shulkers. It gets stuck if you give it an empty one, but just don't do that. All right? It's not much to ask. Obviously, there's improvements that could be made. Frankly, though, if I redesign this again, I'm going to go insane. I made this video not so you could use my design, but so that you would have an easier time making your design. If you do want my design, the world download is in the description, along with links to my spreadsheets and math for making your own design. That's all from me. I hope you've enjoyed. Thanks for watching.